A couple things that really struck me from Kim was her comments early on about the new normal is lightning speed and mastering crowds. Timely communication builds timeless brands, I thought was an excellent point. The towers of Madison Avenue will be replaced by the Tower of Babel. How are you harnessing that Tower of Babel? We're going from the golden age to the platinum age of creativity. Of course, the 4 Ps, purpose, presence, proximity, and partnership that Kim shared with us. And on that first notion of purpose, keep that one in mind when we hear Professor Strauss from UCLA, USC with us a little bit later today. He's going to talk a whole lot about that notion of purpose when it comes to building a modern brand. And then partnership in particular, I think a great line that I wrote down and circled from Kim was that you can stand out by standing together. So I think right away, a terrific opening presentation. Thank you, Kim, to set the stage for us as brand marketers. What does it mean to build a modern brand, build brand equity, and move cases in this era of the new normal? So thank you for that excellent kickoff. So now let's shift gears to our second speaker. We'll have our second speaker and then a short break following Katie. But Katie Elfering is a senior director at Iconoculture. She's based in Minneapolis, so like me, based in Chicago. We're from the cold weather towns, not where it's 80 degrees like it is here in Manhattan, oddly, at this time of year. But I first met Katie at an event in Atlanta that Coca-Cola hosted on social, local, and mobile. And what really struck me was Katie's mastery and really ability to communicate in depth better than anyone that I've seen what's inside the head of this Gen C. So let's spend the next 40 minutes or so with Katie digging deep into what makes Gen C tick, and I promise you that you will really understand this target audience much, much better after hearing Katie than you do now. So Katie, please.
Thank you. All right. Hi, everybody. So like Jim said, I'm from Minneapolis. I'm battling a similar nasal congestion thing today, although I can't call it allergies because nothing has grown there yet. We had a foot of snow today. I'm very happy to be here and not at home shoveling and battling what my husband called snow lightning and then followed up with a curse word in a text message this morning. So I'm very happy to be here and talking to you, and I'm going to have a couple goals. One, we're going to get to know Gen C, and two, I'm going to try not to sneeze on any of you, especially here in the front section as I fidget and walk around. So we're going to talk about Gen C. We're talking about who they are and what makes them tick and what matters to them and how to engage with them. You know, Jim set this up really nicely as we were talking about it this morning. We're sort of talking about a demographic group, but we're also talking about a mindset. It is definitely young, right? We're definitely talking about millennials or Gen Y or that 18 to 34 group that everybody's talking about right now. But we're also talking about this idea of being connected, being creative, being a curator, being an individual in that sort of world of mass communication. So we're going to look at a couple different things that sort of define this generation, and then we're going to look at the things that, you know, maybe work best to engage with them from a marketing perspective. There's a couple big charts that are going to pop up here just to get a little bit of a level set. This is from Nielsen last year when they started to define this idea of Gen C, and they've dubbed this Gen C as well, that idea that this generation over-indexes in their technology ownership, in their media consumption. They tend to just be more connected. Why the C is there, right? That idea of connection. And it's no surprise, I think, you know, this isn't sort of groundbreaking research that I'm showing you here today by saying, you know, look, they're really heavily connected. They use this technology. They use it more than other groups. That's not super surprising. Even more recent data, some pretty charts from eMarketer that have come out recently, don't really sort of shatter the notions about this generation, right? Smartphone ownership really, really high. Heavy usage of social media. Over half of Twitter users are millennials. We know that they're connected. We know that this is the world that they live in. But the thing that I think a lot of people forget when we talk about Gen C or even just the millennial generation as a whole is the priorities they put on this kind of connection. If you look at this chart from Nielsen, this is from last year, and you look at that 25 to 34 group, among those in that group that were making less than $35,000 a year, $35,000 or yes, that green bar of smartphone ownership is 58%. Now think about how much a smartphone costs, and think about how much a smartphone contract costs, unless you go with T-Mobile today. Think about how those things together eat up a ton of your budget if you are making less than $35,000 a year, and how much you have to prioritize those devices and that need for connection to spend that kind of money. And we see 58%. This is a year ago. That number is obviously higher now. What we're talking about is a generation that doesn't just do this because they can, they do it because they have to. They're connected not because it's a nice, fun thing to do. It's not just narcissism. It's not just the fact that this technology exists. It's because it's a big priority in their lives, and they feel it as a necessity, as a need, as opposed to just a fun, frivolous thing to do. So we know these numbers. We know some things about this generation in terms of, tech ownership and media usage and things like that. Let's actually talk about their mindsets. Let's talk about what actually matters to them as they're sort of living their lives and establishing these lifestyles and identities for themselves. And you heard a lot of these words. You're going to keep hearing them throughout the day. I feel like we should have made like buzzword bingo cards for all of you, or if it was maybe later in the day, we should have made a drinking game out of this, or maybe for some of you, 10 a.m. is okay for a drinking game. But we're going to talk about a couple of these words that I think are really important to this generation and their mindset in terms of sort of how they engage with the world around them, with people around them, with the things and brands that matter to them. So the first one is that they're connected. We're talking about a generation, as we just sort of looked at numbers, that's very connected. But you'll notice that that's not the word I'm putting up here. I'm saying they're connectors. And you're going to see a theme happening where it's a little bit more active. They aren't just connected. They are connecting. They are connectors. They are actively going out and doing this. A lot of this has to do with smartphones, right? A lot of this has to do with the teeny tiny computers, as my father-in-law calls them, that we all carry around in our pockets, and that we use to stay connected on a regular basis. But it's more than just that. It's not just being able to connect. It's the act of actually connecting that is so important for this generation. It's not just sharing a review on Foursquare or Yelp or posting a picture somewhere because you can. It's with intent and purpose behind it so that you can connect your experience to someone else's, whether it's real or aspirational. I post that picture of my breakfast, not because I find it that interesting, but because someone else might go to that restaurant and want to order that dish and want to have an idea of what it looks like ahead of time. I'm trying to establish that connection. Sure, it seems ridiculous posting pictures of our breakfast, and yet there's a purpose behind it as you look at this generation and the way that they are connecting. They are also creators. Have you guys seen this app? It's called Over. It's one that works with Instagram. You can put text and different sort of things on top of your Instagram photos. Really fun, really simple, pretty straightforward. I like playing with it because it lets you put really ridiculous captions on your Instagram photos for no reason other than that you can put a ridiculous caption on your Instagram photo. But it's this idea that we're talking about creators. Again, not just being creative, being creators. And we see this a lot with this generation, the need to make something of their own, whether it's physical or whether it's an experience. One of the things that I find interesting is looking at how we see this generation do this with content that's out on the web, right? You think about all the YouTube parodies that exist and how the first reaction for a lot of Gen C is to see something they like on YouTube and then make it themselves, mock it themselves, right? We've all seen a billion Harlem Shake videos. We've all seen all the Gangnam Style reproductions. But it's happening with brands, too. Has anybody seen, maybe people from Jack Daniels are here, has anybody seen the latest Jack Daniels campaign that's really focused on nostalgia and pop culture and sort of the history and heritage? Anybody seen this campaign? Really, really beautiful, beautiful campaign, great online approach to it. The reason I bring it up, a good friend of mine actually said to me the other night while we were out, hey, have you seen this campaign? And I said, yeah, I think it's really pretty. It's really good. He goes, you know what my first instinct was? I wanted to take all my pictures from college that have Jack in them and make my own, like, history of Jack with my life. And I was like, I don't think you should do that for a lot of really, really good reasons. Namely, I'm in some of those pictures, and two, that's not exactly how I think the brand wants themselves to be portrayed. But what I thought was so interesting was this 30-something guy, his first instinct in seeing Jack Daniels telling their story of where they've been through all of pop culture and history, his first instinct was to tell his history of Jack Daniels. Now, again, not necessarily an appropriate history, but that was his first reaction. That says something really interesting about this generation. They're curators. We could talk about Pinterest. We could talk about sites like it, like Fancy, like Supply, which is really interesting. But I think what's really noteworthy when we talk about Gen C as curators is it's not that they're doing it just for themselves. Again, it has that bigger importance to them, that purpose of doing it. I want to curate these things so that I can do more. The challenge with that, and I would argue that this is a pretty big brand opportunity, is that as we set up all of these sort of filters and as we curate our lives, we start to miss out on discovery, right? And if anybody's read The Filter Bubble, you kind of understand the concept that as we sort of keep filtering things to things that we like or things that we know or things that are familiar, we start maybe missing out on things that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise. That idea of serendipity starts to fall away a little bit. Serendipity is my favorite buzzword of the moment, by the way. The challenge, and this is why you hear words like FOMO or the fear of missing out a lot with this generation, is that we have all these tools that let us curate. We have all these tools that let this generation in particular sort of drive this really beautiful picture of their lives. But there is that chance of missing out. And I think that's a huge opportunity for brands to help them both find the things they love, but also help on that discovery side. There's an interesting app I use that helps me do this every day. It's called News Me. And basically what it does is it looks at my Twitter feed, and every single day it gives me an email every morning in my inbox. It's the only one that I open with intent and purpose every day because it's the only one I actually really care about every day of the hundreds I get every morning. And it says, here's the 6 biggest topics that were in your Twitter feed yesterday. And then it says, here's 3 things you might have missed because people in your feed weren't directly talking about it or sending it directly to you. That's really powerful, that 3 things at the bottom. It's curated the things that it knows I probably care the most about, given my Twitter feed and who I follow and my stream and all of that. And then it says, here's 3 things you might have missed out on just in case. That's a really big deal for this hyper-curated generation to enable that discovery on a very simple, straightforward level. The last one is not a verby type word. It's not an or. It's the idea that this is a generation of individuals. And we talk all the time, especially when it comes to millennials, about are they all, perfect little snowflakes that all have their own individuality and, oh, they're all so unique and special. But that's the mindset, right? That, we have been raised, and we have, as a society, raised young people to have this really strong sense of individual identity. Dr. Pepper capitalizing on it in a really very, very straightforward way in this campaign, right? I am one of a kind, and very straightforward representation of that. When you have a generation who has that mindset, personal relevance becomes more important than ever. It's not about mass anymore. It's about me and what matters to me. And I have to be able to see myself in what you're telling me. That's why I love the Jack example with my friend, because he actually found that personal relevance in the campaign. Again, he's not making this video, so if people from Jack Daniels are here, don't worry, it's not going anywhere. But the idea that that was what mattered to him was his own story in that. And I think that's what's really interesting when we look at this generation. So we're going to show a video quick of a brand that's doing this pretty well, that's hitting on these 4 mindsets pretty well in one singular campaign that they're working on. So if we could roll the Taco Bell video quick.
This year at South by Southwest, Taco Bell's Feed the Beat program will partner with Twitter and thousands of fans across America to create an experimental fan-made rockumentary. This is the story of 2 Feed the Beat bands, one an indie sensation, the other about to break into the spotlight. Shot and directed by you, the fans, as you work alongside our director online and add your voice to the film through photos, videos, and tweets. Culminating at South by Southwest's most hyped venue. As a crowd of fans captures every moment, you'll follow along at home from a front row seat, live at feedthebeat.com. Join the film, take the stage, make rock history. Because we're not making the first of its kind documentary. You are.
So that last idea, right, that you are the ones who are making this, it gets that idea of individualism. You talk about the creator aspect. There's a connected piece to it. You're curating your own view of the show, which is really interesting. They do a really nice job of hitting on all of those points. And I think Taco Bell is somebody who's doing this really well. They're doing a nice job of figuring out the things that matter to GenC and making it easy. If you watch the Cool Ranch Doritos Loco Taco rollout, they did a lot of this there too. And that's really great because Taco Bell has some of that credibility to do it. The big question is, how do we do this? What if I sell toothpaste? What if I sell cars? What if I'm trying to get them to bank with me? What if I'm trying to get them to buy high-end fashion? How do we get to those mindsets and do something interesting with that? How do we do something that has meaning to this generation? How do we engage them, right? That's the big question. If we know these things about them, what do we do with that? This is the slide that I always sort of threaten to drop the mic and just walk off the stage on and say, well, this is all you have to do, like, boom, I'm out. Like, just sort of be done with it. Because I think this is pretty much the most straightforward way you could say how to engage with this generation. It's the best Google search I've ever done is to find this image. I'll be interested if you'll be interesting. We know it's not that simple, right? Like, it's not that simple to say, well, just be interesting. Boom, I'm out. Like, I'm done. See you later. Have a nice afternoon. That's not as simple as that, but it kind of is. It isn't that much more complicated than that either. I mean, it is in terms of actual execution. But in terms of how to engage with this generation, if you give them something to be interested in, they'll be interested in it. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Now, of course, there's challenges to this now. So as soon as I say this and say, this is all you have to do, this is so simple, just be interesting. Now I'm going to tell you all the reasons that that's really hard to do. This is why this is hard to do. This is how we used to communicate. There was a wall, not a Facebook wall, an actual wall in a place that people painted pictures on, and everybody looked at that wall. There was one story about cows and maybe unicorns or whatever's happening up here. It was one story that everybody paid attention to on one platform, one medium. There wasn't all this other stuff going on. This is the world today. This is a picture from last year's Super Bowl of teenagers watching the Super Bowl. Notice this kid. This kid's my favorite, the one that's in the back, sort of right there, that's looking the exact opposite direction of all of his friends. Like, I have no idea what this kid is doing. I seriously want to find him and find out what he was doing while everybody else was somewhere else. Like, maybe they don't like him. Maybe he's like the cool kid. I don't know. This is them watching the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl is interesting, right? Like, we know the Super Bowl is interesting. Blackouts happen. The game could be really good. Somebody's leg could fall off. Like, stuff happens in the Super Bowl. These kids are all on their phones. And hopefully they're doing something that's not distraction. And maybe they're doing something that's companion in terms of the behavior that they're exhibiting. But the likelihood is they're doing something that's not tied directly to the game in terms of engaging with that content. These are girls going and having coffee with their friends. This is from a great BuzzFeed post about why don't we hang out with our friends, and they have hundreds of these photos. This is what happens. They're doing something interesting. You're having coffee with your friends. Nope, you're not. You're all on your phones and you're doing something totally. Maybe they're looking up something that they were all just talking about. That's our hope, right? Is that they were like, oh, I want to look something up together. This is not from this year's basketball tournament. This kid's team is up by 3 with 2 seconds left. There is nothing more interesting than that. And he is heads down in his phone. And I'm not trying to be disparaging or like mock this kid. I mean, we've all done this, right? Like, everybody in this room at some point or another has probably done something similar to this. It's not even to say that the distraction that he might be engaging in is bad. I'm not saying that at all. But this is why it's so hard to engage with this generation today. 3-point game, less than 3 seconds left, and this kid is face down in his phone. It's pretty tough to get that attention. We don't have just one wall anymore. We have a lot of walls and a lot of screens and a lot of platforms. And so how do you get that interesting thing in front of them? Well, one of the ways, and I love this quote, it's from Ross Martin at Viacom, one of the ways is to give them something they have to share, that they can't not share, that they have to put out in front of other people because it's so great that if I don't tell somebody else about it, they're going to miss out on it, and I have to share this. And that sounds really simple again, right? Like, be interesting and give them something to share. I'm not laying out anything that's too complicated here. But we know that this is kind of challenging today. And part of the challenge is in the sort of mass communication world that we live in. There's an interesting conversation that was happening on Twitter a few weeks back between Brian Stelter of the New York Times and Gavin Purcell, who's a producer at Jimmy Fallon. And they were talking about this kind of idea. They were talking about it specifically in terms of the second screen, in terms of TV viewing. And they were saying, you know, is this true interactivity? And Gavin Purcell, who's the producer at Jimmy Fallon, said, it's really hard because when you're going one-to-many, you can't actually do real interactivity because it's not truly interactive in that situation. But when it becomes personalized, it's no longer mass. So there's this weird tension in terms of giving people something they want that's individualized, that's personal, that's relevant, that they want to share, but also in knowing that your audience is bigger than just one-to-one. And this is the shift that we've seen in this space. We've moved from mass communication to a mass of communicators, to this generation that wants to be sharing, that wants to be involved, that doesn't want to be advertised to, that wants to be advertised with, that wants to be part of that process to make it relevant, to make it shareable, to make it interesting. I love the OB example because it was something that was really interesting. You could personalize it and you could share it, and it hit all of those notes. It became something that was at a mass of communicators, not mass communication. Now, there's ways to do this. This is another example from Twitter that happened a few weeks ago. This lovely woman, Laura, said, oh my God, I like chocolate so much, I'm following both Kit Kat and Oreo. Well, Kit Kat jumped on it and said, all right, Oreo, let's battle for her affection. Tic-tac-toe, you're up. And then Oreo said, because they're the social media darlings right now, and they're just on a roll with everything they do, they were like, oh, sorry, Kit Kat, we're going to eat your candy bar. And then Laura replied and was like, oh my God, I'm in heaven, and she's so excited. Here's the thing. This is not scalable, right? This is not the best way to build brand loyalty. You can't do this. Like, imagine for your brands if you replied to every single person that mentioned you on Twitter with something like this. Like, good theory, terrible in practice and execution. This is not scalable. This is not necessarily the best way to build those brand relationships. But in this case, it works, right? And it's that idea of finding the balance between doing something like this and something that's really, really mass in a way that can actually get us from advertising to engagement. And I think that's the big shift we're seeing, that massive communication to mass communicators, this shift from advertising to engagement. That's what GenC is really craving. This, to me, is another one of those really big quotes that, again, like finding it was like a gold mine to me. Because this gets at that idea, right? Brand is not what you tell your consumers. It's what they tell each other about you. That's a really big point when we're talking about a mass of communicators, when we're talking about a generation who wants to be sharing and involved. You can tell them as many things as you want, but all that really matters is what they say. Here's an interesting example of that. When you think about what Chipotle wants people to be talking about them, it's probably about antibiotic-free chickens. It might be about their organic hoodie line that they've launched recently. What people are talking about on social media is the quesarito. Does anybody know what a quesarito is? I can tell you. Have you had one? I've never heard of anyone who's actually had one of these, but these pictures exist. This is a burrito, but instead of a tortilla, they use a cheese-filled quesadilla as the outer wrapping. Just process that for a second, how much cheese that is, how thick that would be. You can see the pictures of it. It's like a monstrosity of both awesomeness and terrifyingness. This is what people are talking about on social media. These are actually pulled just by doing a search of quesarito. And these are just a few of the hundreds, thousands of things people are talking about. Chipotle does not want you talking about this. This is not something they're marketing. You're not going to see like, look, we put antibiotic-free chickens in the quesarito. Like, they're not going to do that because this is not the thing that they want people talking about their brand. But this is what people are talking about. And they've addressed it in different sort of articles about this. They've said, we don't intend to be In-N-Out Burger, no secret menu. If you order it, you'll probably get it. But like, let's not make this a thing, people. And yet, it's a thing, people, because it exists out there. This is what people are talking about this brand. And I think when we talk about this massive communicators, that's the challenging part. You can give them all the great marketing and PR and advertising you want to, and then the quesarito happens. So what do we do with that? What does that look like when we actually try to put it into action? What are some brands doing to sort of hit on all these points that we're talking about? Well, one of the things that I think is interesting, and this has sort of led us internally at Iconoculture to develop a model of engagement for GenC, for millennials, for this very connected consumer, is this idea that for brands to really succeed with them, it has to be less about what the brand says or gives and more about what they help the consumer achieve. And I love that that's a verb there because it's really about that ability to help consumers do something. And so we created a model that started with do. Your first job is to help people do something. And then we thought, well, there's some other verbs that seem really important here, though, too. You think back to that idea of curation and how we said discovery is really important. So helping people know something, whether it's know information or helping them discover something in a big way. And then we thought, well, there's more to it than that, though. It's also about helping people create something, right? Helping them create a moment. Maybe create like a real thing. Has anybody played with MakerBot's new like scannable copy and paste from the real world stuff? It's amazing. I want one in my house. I don't know what I would make with it except for a bunch of like useless plastic stuff, but I just want to make all of the useless plastic stuff that I can because you can actually do it now. That's not exactly what we're talking about with create, me having a MakerBot at home. It's more the idea of creating things and experiences and moments. And so when we think about what brands can do with this, it's really that idea that if you could take these verbs, or maybe there's other verbs that are more important to your brand or to your audience in particular. We started with these because they were nice and broad and sort of well-rounded, but really use this as a way to engage this consumer. So we're going to start with do, and I'm going to show you a couple examples of brands that are doing these things well. There's a quote that I found a few weeks back that was really interesting to me in terms of this sense of do, which was the idea that really all you have to do is give people a good product, right? We've all heard this in the past. If you make a really good product, marketing is done for you. I love that this 29-year-old guy said it fairly eloquently and said, you know, as long as you make a good product, we'll do all your marketing for you, right? Like Chipotle's not marketing the quesarito, but apparently it's a good product and people are talking about it. The idea that, you know, we want to share this stuff with our friends. That's what we want to be doing. So if you give us something to share, if you give us a product that works in our lives, that works in this capacity, we'll do that for you. We want to talk about this stuff. We want to share this. I use an example from my own life all the time in this. I like craft beer a lot. I like really hoppy craft beers, the kind that like burn off your taste buds because there's so many hops in them. And when I find a good one, I tell my friends about it. I live in Minneapolis. We're a great beer city for this kind of stuff right now. So every time I find a new one, I share it with my friends. I check into it on Untapped, or when we're at the bar, I say, hey, I've had this one. You have to try it. It's all word of mouth. None of these craft breweries are doing a ton of marketing to get me to say that. They're not getting me to like them to do that. None of that's happening. I just found something I liked, and I wanted to tell my friends who also like beer to try it too. And it sounds really simple and straightforward, and it's definitely a focus group of one, but this is what we're talking about with that do mentality. Give people something that works for them, that helps them do something. In that case, helps me enjoy my beer because you're making a very good product, and I'm going to tell people about it. Sometimes it's very low tech. This is what a Whole Foods did for Valentine's Day. This particular Whole Foods is known for having incredibly long lines after work as men are going in to buy their girlfriends or wives or significant others or kids or dogs or whoever flowers for Valentine's Day. And so what they did to sort of combat that, to make the flower buying process better, is they set up a cooler with a handwritten sign and said, we're going to sell you a beer for $2 while you wait because we know that the line is long. They're helping you do something, buy flowers, in a much more enjoyable way because now you are drunk while you are doing it. I don't know if the girlfriends and wives and partners and pets and kids are so happy when, you know, the man comes home with the flowers after he's had a few beers in line, but it's really simple and it's shareable. This was pulled off Instagram. That's where we saw this, was somebody saying this was such a good idea that this brand thought of, that they had to put it out there to share with other people. Sometimes it's a bit more high tech. Has anybody used the Now app? Has anybody played with this at all? It's been out for a little while. An interesting app that helps you actually know what's going on in your city and get there and do it all based on Instagram photos. What's really interesting is they have an actual person that sort of sits behind the scenes and helps curate some of this, so it's half algorithmic driven and half human being at a computer, which is really fascinating in today's world, to have somebody who's actually thinking about that curation on a very specific level. But basically what it does is it takes Instagram photos, puts them together in kind of a heat map and says, this is what's going on in this city right now. You can go and do it. You can go join this event. You can go find this thing that's happening. It helps consumers, it helps Gen C go and do something. This is another brand that's doing this in a very direct way. It's very nice that they put the verb that I'm using right in their slogan. The idea of do what you love. And Camper's doing this really interesting campaign. Has an online component where basically the question is, what would you do if you had a day off? If you had a day off and could do anything you wanted to do in the world, what would you do? And what they've done is they've given their employees days off and then filmed them doing whatever they would do on their day off to make that point. Now, if I'm an employee, I don't know that on my day off what I want is my company filming me for a marketing campaign. But maybe if what I got to do is paid for by the company and it was something really extravagant and extreme, we've had people on this go baking, we've had people go to the beach, we've had people do a lot of different things as part of this campaign that's really, really simple and straightforward. What can we help you do? We'll give you the day to do it. What can we help you do? And they've asked people to share their days, and the plan is eventually to sort of help other people do that as well. So it's really simple, it's really straightforward, but it gets at that idea that our job as a brand is to help you do something, and in this case, very literally. The next idea is no. And the idea of no is sort of twofold. On the one hand, it is about helping people learn and grow and have information. This is a Tumblr from Electrolux, where they have videos and cooking demos, and it's meant to be taken into the kitchen with you on your mobile devices. It's made on Tumblr, but meant to be very heavily used on mobile, in the kitchen with videos that you play and stop as you're cooking and doing all that kind of stuff. It has recipes. It has really, really beautiful imagery around food. It has lots of information. This is a very literal version of no, the idea that they're helping you know something about food, how to potentially use their products as you're cooking, right? But the idea that this is really about knowing from an information perspective. That said, no, I think, is also about that idea of discovery. South by Southwest, Dennis Crowley gave a really interesting talk where he said this quote that has stuck with me since then, where he said, "We want to make magic out of your data." And he talked a lot about the idea that, and if you've seen Foursquare's new update, by the way, they really have tried to do this, and is much more about explore and search and discover than checking in or points or badges. But the idea that we want to help you discover things around you, to help you know what's going on, to give you information, but to help you do more without looking down at your screen all the time, which is really interesting. We see that same thing coming from other people like Colin Rainey from IDEO, who said serendipity is finding what you're not looking for. And I think part of this idea of knowing is about that discovery element, being able, from a brand, to help people discover events, experiences, discover products, discover whatever it might be, but that they might not have even known that they were looking for, which is really interesting. And part of it comes from that data. Brands have so much data about consumers now, and so much of it gets used for marketing, but could it get used for other things? Nike's a good poster child for this, right? They have all this data about how much you run and how much you sort of work out and the routes you take and how fast you're going and all of that. And instead of just using that to sell you shoes, because they could do that and say, well, we know all these things about you. Here's when your shoes are going to run out. We're going to sell you shoes. So they give it back to you and let you track your own health and behavior to help make changes in your life. Ford is doing this right now. They have a partnership with public utility companies around the country to track when energy usage is at its highest and lowest and when are the best times to sort of charge hybrid cars. And instead of just sort of keeping that internally, they're putting it out to consumers in a program called My Energy so that you can see when the most affordable time to charge your car actually is. That idea that there's magic in data, I think, is really interesting, and it comes back to this know point in a really big way. There's some really simple versions of this too, though, that don't even involve data. What Crate & Barrel's doing lately has been really, really interesting to watch. If you've seen what's in their catalogs and then it translates into mobile and online, they're not just selling you decanters and pasta makers and couches and blankets and all the things you need to sit around by a fire and have a cup of hot chocolate, although I guarantee there's not hot chocolate in that mug. They're giving you Scrabble to play while you're doing that. They're giving you apps and playlists and recipes and things that you might not have thought of to make that experience better. You've thought about the bowls you need and the decanter and the friends you're going to invite over and all those things. And what about the game you're going to play? What about the playlist that you want to put on while you're having that experience? They've started adding to that discovery piece by putting in sort of content that partners with what they're selling. Starbucks does this, right? They have the partnership with Apple. They do that. We've seen other brands do this. But I think this one's really interesting in particular that it's coming in their catalogs, first of all, in a very sort of non-techie medium, but it has that very connected component that this generation in particular craves. We see the discovery on a couple other fronts too. Back to that idea of partnerships, Etsy and West Elm doing some really interesting things with their pop-up shops. This is one that happened in LA, and they had a blogger and stylist named Emily Henderson, who is on HGTV as well. She picked her favorite Etsy people, and they did a pop-up shop at a West Elm. But it's really interesting the way that you could find out about this. If you followed Emily, she talked about it a lot. She promoted it pretty heavily on her Twitter feed and on her blog that she was doing this. She put out calls for people to recommend their favorite LA-based Etsy storefronts and get them involved, because she doesn't know every Etsy storefront in LA. That would be impossible and insane. And so she asked people for help. She crowdsourced some of that. You might have found it through her. You might have found it through West Elm. They promoted it pretty heavily. You might have found it through Etsy. You might have found it through a friend. But that discovery element becomes really interesting in both a sort of high-tech social media and low-tech. This was a very, arts and crafts in-person moment that happened. The last idea is create. And we see a lot of this with GenC, right? That desire to create. My friend wanting to make his own Jack Daniels commercial. We see it in the sense that they're literally creating things. Anybody contribute to the Veronica Mars Kickstarter? They've raised $1 bazillion now. Warner Brothers is going to make so much money off of this, and us for contributing. This is something, though, that's really straightforward, right? They're creating a movie as a generation. We're saying, we want this movie made, we're going to make it happen. Since then, the calls for other movies to be made, but also the calls for movies that shouldn't be made, if you've seen the parody ones around, please don't make this movie, and wondering if you can start a Kickstarter to fund the non-making of certain movies. Fascinating to watch. But that idea that there's a creation element to this is really interesting. There's also that sense of that user-generated content around a brand. Has anybody seen your LL Bean Boyfriend? Has anybody been on this site? So if you're familiar with things like Unhappy Hipsters or Catalog Living, this is very much in the vein of that. It is a Tumblr that, if you can't read it, says, he will build you a table and then have sex with you on it. Doesn't get much hotter than that. It's sort of mocking right? It's sort of mocking the LL Bean aesthetic. It's putting a little bit of a snarky romantic spin on it, you know, and it's pulling stuff directly from their site and their catalog, and it's really, really funny. The thing is like LL Bean could probably sue this woman, because this woman this is not an LL Bean sanctioned thing, right? Like they didn't make this, and they could probably sue this woman and say, take this down. We don't want this up there. Like, stop talking about our male models having sex on tables. You know, they could do that. And instead what they've done, and we've seen this in different articles where they've referenced this, they've said, we think it's kind of great. Like, this woman wants to spend her time promoting our products through funny commentary. Have at it. And it's gotten a lot of followers on Tumblr. It's also gotten a lot of copycats. There's your Urban Outfitters boyfriend. He does not look like this guy. He's wearing a beanie and has a skateboard. He doesn't look like he's showered yet today. You see some of those parody ones that are out there as well, but it's that idea that people are creating this about your brand, and your options are sue them or maybe embrace it casually. You don't have to necessarily put your stamp of approval and copyright on it, but that casual embrace, I think, is something that really works for this generation. We're going to show another example now that's a video of another version of this kind of creation. It plays a little bit off that Taco Bell promotion that we saw earlier from South by Southwest, but the idea that people are getting more involved in the sort of creation of some of these campaigns and some of these experiences. So we'll roll the forward video quick. So again, kind of like the Taco Bell ad, right? We're seeing a lot of this, right? Help us make our documentary commercial, or whatever you want to call it. But it's interesting because it gets at that idea that we want you to be part of the process. And it's not just, you know, send us your Super Bowl ad as a contest and we're going to see if it makes it on the air. And if it doesn't, we're never going to tell you what happens to it ever again. And it will go into a black hole of user-generated content that has to exist somewhere. Instead, you're actually going to see what happens with this. You know, you're actually going to see the outcome of what happened when you participated, when you were a co-creator of our content. The same kind of thing is happening, I think, across a lot of industries. I'm sure a lot of you have seen the Expedia campaign. I like this one because it has the word story in it, which is also sort of the biggest buzzword of the day, the idea of storytelling. But the idea that they're saying, we want your story as part of our brand. We want you to tell us what you found by traveling. And they're not afraid to go a bit, you know, edgy with it. If you've seen the one that's down at the bottom of the dad who travels to his lesbian daughter's wedding, and he talks about his reservations and he talks about his concerns, and then he tells how he finally saw his daughter and her wife together and how happy he really was. And it's really beautiful and it's really poignant and it's very personal. And it's that idea that if you can see your story within the brand, that's what really matters. It goes back to my friend with Jack, right? He sees his own story in it. It makes him want to create something because he has that kind of connection. So this is the model we've come up with. This is sort of our version of thinking about this. There might be verbs that are different for you all when you think about Gen C. There might be some of these that you might tweak a bit, but these are the sort of three verbs that we internally at Iconoculture have talked about a lot when it comes to Gen C. And if I'm going to leave you with one thing, it's going to be this quote from Matt Britton at Mr. Youth. And I love it as sort of a wrap up to what we've been talking about. Instead of giving you like a bunch of bullet pointed implications, I think this sums it up really nicely. If you can give consumers content that they care about, that they're interested in, that they want to share, that they can't not engage with in some way because it's so compelling or interesting or funny or informative or whatever that might be, if you can do that, they will care, they will engage with you, they will pay attention to you, and they will get other people to do the same thing. And for a very connected generation of masses of communicators who are constantly creating, connecting, curating, and thinking about themselves and their own identities, this is a really big deal and a really big opportunity. So with that, I'm going to say you all are lucky that I didn't sneeze on you, and I'm very proud of myself for that. And thank you very much for letting me talk to you, and I'm happy to take some questions and things like that if we have time. Questions, concerns? Anybody else have allergies? We could have like an allergy pill convention up there, yeah.
A little bit more. Sorry, I asked if there's any differences in gender. When we look at women, we see them a little bit more into the curation, and men not so much. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've seen some differences. I could probably, you know, with a few minutes notice, pull up a whole bunch of stats that tell you the differences between some of those things. We tend to see women want to be more on the conversation side, where men tend to be more on the direct recommendation, which I think is really interesting. And the idea that I'm just going to tell you what it is that I like, and I'm not going to have to like expound on it forever, which sounds so stereotypical. I hate to say things like that sound so stereotypical, but it's true. Just from a sort of how much effort you want to put into that communication. I think that's why you see a lot of I just want to create my online video and put it out there on the men's side because it's easier, where women want to have a bigger, longer conversation that might involve more things like words. But I do think that generally speaking, we're seeing less of those gender splits. We're seeing more commonalities, and I think part of that has to do with the fact that when we study millennials, and that's where I spend most of my time is studying this generation, we see so much less gender separation in general with them that a lot of those things that we may have seen in the past are blurring together more. There's just more mixed gender time spent together. It doesn't really matter if your recommendation is coming from a man or a woman or whoever it is in your world. It's do they actually know anything about it? Like I have guy friends who respect my perspective on beer more than my husband's, which drives him nuts, but I know it better, so they listen to me more. He knows whiskey better, so like in his defense, he's way better at that. But that idea that it's less about the gender side of it and more about the actual expertise and influence that you can wield based on what you actually know. That makes sense? Yeah?
So how big is this market, and are they spending money?
If we talk about it, well, GenC is a bit more nebulous, I think, to define, and we'll hear some more defining things about it. If we look at millennials in particular, though, that which we define as 18 to 34, 78 million people, their spending power is pushing $2 trillion. Like, that's a big deal. If you don't pay attention to them for any other reason, there's just so many of us and them out there, right? Like, a lot of us in this room fit into that. There's so many that at some point, even if they never make as much money as their parents, or even if none of them ever move out of the house or get jobs or whatever, they're still going to be the biggest group of consumers. So you have to pay attention at the very least at that level. You don't have to like them, but you have to pay attention to them because there's a lot of them and they have a lot of theoretical potential. Let's put it that way. I don't know, GenC we can define a little bit more broadly, so I think it's, you know, a wider definition, but if we look at that millennial generation in particular, it's huge. Yeah.
So one of my coworkers said that her daughter tweeted, "Twitter is the only thing that parents haven't ruined yet." So just out of curiosity, do they have that same perception with brands? So, you know, there's these big splashy ideas that people have really interacted with, but on the most part, do they really want to interact with brands, or do they just want to interact with their friends?
I think it's there. I think GenC is fine interacting with brands in social media when brands do it well. It's the fact that, like, not to be rude to anyone in the room, but most people don't do it as well as they could, right? And that's the challenge, I think, is when a brand is interacting well in social media, that's awesome, that's legit, let's hang out, let's do that. But it's acting more like a person than a brand, I think, is what tends to work better there. Because the reason you go to social media, the reason you go to connect is to connect with people. And when a brand is coming in there and sounding like a brand, that's a lot harder to do. It also has a lot to do with, I think, respecting platforms. Knowing that Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus and Snapchat and Instagram and Vine and all the other millions of social networks out there, they're all very, very different. And the way that people want to interact on them are very different. It's funny, I saw something the other day, like a tweet or something, an article that was talking about Facebook in particular, where it said, young people now are saying Facebook is only for old people, and old people still think that Facebook is only for young people. So, like, who are these billion people that are on Facebook, right? And so I think that's part of it too, is thinking about how these networks are used and perceived. If young people don't think anybody's, like, that Facebook is for the olds, and the olds think that Facebook is for the youngs, then, like, there's who, I mean, Gen X is a small generation, and they're not the ones driving all of the Facebook usage. So who is sort of there? I think that's part of the challenge too, is it's not that there's a reluctance to engage in social media, it's that you have to really, really know what these platforms are doing well and how they're working really well. Like, I think some of the Twitter examples were really great because it was brands who got Twitter. They knew it, they understood it, the real-time nature of it, all of that worked really well. You couldn't have done that same thing with the Kit Kat and the Oreo on Facebook. It wouldn't have worked, you shouldn't have done it on Facebook if you were gonna try to do it there. You could have maybe done it through Instagram, maybe, but it wouldn't have had that same real-time nature. And I think that's part of the other challenge is brands making sure they know what each of these platforms are good for and thinking about that really strategically to actually target them really, really well. That's why I'm super excited about things like Vine right now, because we're seeing brands actually use that in an interesting way, or Instagram, both being used really well by brands lately, which is really interesting because they're both still fairly new. But it's so clear what they do well that it makes it a lot easier to figure that out. Whereas I think still places like Facebook and Twitter become a bit more, they're harder to define what people actually want to do there. So that maybe is the other side of that, is some of these newer networks are a lot easier to figure out what you're actually supposed to do, and this generation is open to that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Just want to know your Twitter handle.
Oh, so, okay. You notice that it's not on the screen because I have a personal Twitter handle that's, okay. Okay, it's KTLYNE24. Is that fast enough? It's like I'm giving you my social security number. But I have a work one too that's more like social media-y, millennial-y stuff. That's my actual name, just all one word. So there's two. You can choose if you want to read about like baseball and bourbon, or if you want to read about like Twitter. Thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent, excellent. Love that. Thank you, Katie. Katie and the folks at Iconoculture are fabulous at this. If you want to learn more, I know they'd be happy to help you with that on your brand. But did you notice, at least some of the things that I had written down here, is how Katie, in many senses, gave us sort of the underpinning, the how-to behind a lot of the things that Kim showed us in the first presentation. So remember, Kim told us early on, she said, don't ask who is your brand targeting, but what does your brand stand for? Right? And so the model that Katie then laid out, which is a brand should help your target, help Gen C do something, know something, create something. What is your brand helping them achieve? Right? So I think that's a really sort of good thing to think about and ask yourselves and your brands, what are your brand's verbs? Right? Do, know, create. Katie opened the door to say maybe there's others that are appropriate, but what verbs does your brand stand for? And so on that note, what I'd like to do is we'll take our first break here in a second of the morning. But I promise you that when you come back from this, you will have a life-changing hour. I'm serious, Professor Sasha Strauss is unbelievable. He will, I think, even for all of us who've been in the brand marketing business for a long time, he will open our eyes, open your eyes to thinking about branding in a completely different way, and I know he will inspire you. So please take about 30 minutes. Let's come back at 10 after the hour, and the professor will join us, and then after that, we'll go to lunch. So 30-minute break. Thank you, folks.